sort of environment. And what was happening, if you go back to the history around that time when Islam first came to the world, there were really rich and then there were really poor. There were people that owned land and there were people that worked the land.
And there was no middle class.
There was really no middle class. That's a newer phenomena. And at that time, it was believed that just doesn't work because there was indentured labor. People would get a loan to facilitate some activity in their life, and then two generations would end up paying for it because the interest rates were so high, or the interest charge was so high. It essentially put people into indentured labor, and that was really the driving force behind forbidding usury or interest.
In fact, most people probably don't know that usury is a term still used in the financial industry today and in government. There were anti-usury laws for many years on the books, still to some extent. Though certainly in the day of payday loans, the concept of usury has changed somewhat. But if we come back then to the recent history, so you're thinking about 20 years ago, the thinking started to change. Sure. Where did we first see this around the world?
Well, I think really if you sort of have to look at the Muslim world as an overall image in terms of how large they have become, how the growth has occurred on the financial services side, how the wealth has been accumulated over the last few decades. So primarily the first implementations of these, or the thought processes behind how to implement an overall financial services model that was Sharia compliant, started to come out about 20 or so years ago. There have been some thought leaders on it. There's a fellow out of Pakistan. His name is Taqi Usmani. He literally wrote the first book on it in terms of numbers, the book that got most traction. There were certainly other attempts at this.
And these were people who were starting to think, gee, if we take our religion seriously, then there must be some way to make this happen, right?
That's exactly
So they started to think through what are the possible models.
Absolutely, and I think the market was developing in terms of an opportunity. So we have about 1.2 billion Muslims around the world at this point. And some of the Muslim nations have started to emerge out of a third world status.
Certainly the oil powers in the Middle East.
Right, certainly the shift of power and capital in the Middle East over the last 10 years has helped drive a lot of this. And I think the hotbed of this is still the Middle East. I mean, Dubai is certainly a big market, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, some of those regions. In addition to that, Malaysia has actually taken a tremendous amount of interest in it, and they've developed a lot of products and services. And in Pakistan, there's a big effort going on as well.
So are there differences then between, if you take the model that, or the models that have grown up in the Middle East and what happens in the United States, how are those different or are they not different?
I think, the difference, they're somewhat similar today, although I would say the models that are in the Middle East are a little more evolved because the regulators there understand are Muslims, right, primarily. Right, so they understand the perspective on this, and they're not afraid of it in terms of just having a conversation. Whereas if you look at American model, I mean, the U.S. economy is based on an interest, is built around an interest-based system. And
in fact, the entire Western financial system really is built that way.
Is built on that, and especially in the U.S., that's been the case. And and we saw how some of those models broke down over the last few years. But the challenge is that in the U.S., you can't just come up with a new system and go to the regulators and say, hey, we've just come up with a better model than you have. You sort of have to first prove the model within existing environments. So the models that are here in the U.S., the products that are here, are essentially layers on top of the existing system. So so in some people's perspective, they're not quite as compliant as they need to be. My argument on that whole issue is that certainly the Sharia compliant products and services that are being offered in this country aren't as good as they could be, but they're the first iteration of one. And we have to look at it in terms of an iterative process. We have to start somewhere. We have to show the regulators that there's an opportunity here. We have to prove this market. And that's kind of what happened in UK. In the UK, has I would say about a 10-year lead on us in the versus the US.
So how have, and you being very, very deeply involved in this, by the way, you recognized around the country as one of the experts on Islamic finance, right? So you, I'm sure, have had some interactions with regulators, and how do they react to this? What do you see from them?
I mean, I think the reality is that the regulators are are extremely interested in this whole concept. They're thirsty for knowledge. They just don't necessarily have the education around it. It's a fairly new concept. There's some very nuanced approaches to certain things, and they need guidance. So one of the things that my organization, Zeus Capital, has been doing is that we've been talking to a lot of these regulators and trying to educate them on how it works, how it fits with the existing system, what are the challenges, and we're also trying to build an industry trade group, so to speak, around Islamic finance practitioners, so we can lobby for some of the regulatory changes that need to occur for this to be a substantial model.
Now, what kind of risks are associated with this? Certainly there would be, if regulations change, there's always a regulatory risk.
Sure.
There are also, as we've seen in any financial system, there are systemic risks, though I would guess that Islamic finance in this country is not big enough to cause shockwaves throughout the system. But certainly any kind of lending or financing system contains certain types of risks.
Sure.
What are the new ones that come in as a result of Islamic finance?
Well, I mean, in terms of when you look at it, it's actually a less riskier model than the one that exists today. That doesn't mean that it's more appealing to anybody. It's just most people follow this model because of their belief system. There's no real push to say change the standard model with an Islamic model in terms of a larger community. But if you look at it, the fundamentals of an Islamic finance model are based on assets. Assets, everything is an asset-based entity, whereas paper has no value. I mean, what we saw in the financial meltdown with the CDOs and some of those exotic instruments last year is that paper was valued with other paper, which was valued with other paper. It was sliced and it was diced and it was repackaged, but paper isn't assets. The underlying hard assets still remain the same. If you take $1 worth of hard asset and slice it in 100 pieces and put it together with 10 others that are similar, it doesn't make it $1,000. It's still $1.
Well, there are many who thought otherwise in the recent credit crisis. In fact, when I think about that kind of collapse, it makes me wonder if there were a different system, like, and I'm not proposing certainly that Islamic finance would replace the Western finance, but if we thought in a very large term, are there principles of Islamic finance that might have prevented, if they were implemented in a large scale, that might have prevented this kind of meltdown that we saw?
I mean, I certainly think so, and the Vatican certainly thinks so.
The Vatican?
Yes. Of all places, the Vatican sent out a document which was, I think, about 2.5 months ago, and I wish I had brought a copy for you, but I'll send you one. But in that, they kind of recognize the strengths of the Islamic finance model in terms that it's an asset base, it's a risk-reward sharing model versus a lopsided model that we've seen in the Western Hemisphere, which is that the risk is all shared on one side and the rewards are shared on the other side. This is a more fair and balanced model, and they actually came up with an opinion document on it saying that we believe that there might be some truths in this Islamic finance thing. There might be some things that this Western system can learn, and there's certainly been many others that have echoed that. I just think that Islamic finance is still in infancy. Mm-hmm. It really needs to develop. It needs to. Now, when I say in its infancy, it's not a small market in any ways. I mean, globally,
over 1 billion people. Globally,
right. It's over $1 trillion market today, and it's growing by some estimates at about 20 to 25% a year. As more Muslims come into the middle class, as some of those countries start to accumulate more wealth and intellectual property, and ultimately Muslim countries find themselves in a position where they can implement systems that are more conducive to their beliefs. So that's all starting to happen. This market is really taking place. JP Morgan, HSBC, Deutsche Bank, all of these organizations